Give everybody a couple of minutes to get here. Hi guys, I hope you're doing okay. Hey, we the people, how you doing? Hey, you. I'm not sure how to say it. Is it Alice or Alice? Pedro, good to see you. Stefan, Sarah, Marzi, Jenny, Marilyn. It's good to see you guys. Excellent. I'm glad to see you all here. Very good. So I usually like to start off with something just to give people enough time to get here before we get into hello Bonessa and Daryl, Kate, Nika, Catherine, Joseph. I'm glad to see you guys here. So I like to start off with something just to give people time to get here, give everybody time to catch up. We always have some stragglers come in late, like people who come in after church has already started, try to creep in the back without making any noise. We always have some of those. So I like to give them a little time to do that. So I thought we would start off with something today. We're going to get into, we're going to get back into, we've been talking about the supernatural. We started last time talking about the paranormal, whatever you want to call it. And tonight we're going to go more into vampirism, but just because vampires are probably the most famous or infamous denizens of the supernatural world. And we're going to talk about what they really are, as well as what they're not, comparing how they've been portrayed in fiction, social media, not social media, sorry, how they've been portrayed in novels and fictional works and the media at large, like movies and stuff like that, versus what they are in true traditional tales. And I'm going to give you just a little, just right off the bat, first thing before we start talking about something else. In all of these different stories, like say, if you've ever seen Bram Stoker's Dracula and all that kind of stuff, you usually see that it's somehow or another something connected to the devil in some way, that's how vampires came about. That is absolutely not even remotely true. Vampires were created by magicians. That's where they came from. They were created by magicians who understood how to not go through the second death. And we've talked about that before, how part of what we're doing whenever we do magic, when a person normally dies, they go through the first death and the second death. The first death is the death of the physical body. The second death is the death of the astral body. And this was done for a reason. This was not done to create vampires. That was a side effect. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, while we're giving everybody time to show up, we're going to go back to old Franz Barden. And the reason that I was going to read this part to you, you can see all my little bookmarks in here. This is a book I've looked through a lot, just because there's so many amazing things in here. And it's for all levels of, this is a book I highly recommend. If you guys don't have it, Initiation into Hermetics. It is a very, very easy to read, easy to understand book. It's not always fun because it's written in kind of archaic language, but you can get something out of this book, whether you are just beginning or whether you've been doing magic for years. Either way, there is something in here for you. Marilyn says, do they get stuck in that realm as vampires forever? We're going to get to that in just a second. But the short answer is no. It's a very, very fragile state to maintain. It is a very difficult state to maintain. And there are very specific factors that have to be maintained in order for them to stay in that state. And if those factors are disrupted, disturbed, destroyed in any way, then it destroys the vampire. You know, it's not like in TV where they are invincible and immortal. These things are, when they're dealing with someone who knows the nature of magic, the nature of the universe, how this stuff works, how to handle these sorts of things, they are incredibly fragile. They may not be to the average person, just because the average person doesn't have any, you know, knowledge about this kind of stuff. But if you know what you're dealing with, they're not going to be very formidable for you to deal with at all. There are very things that will make it easy to disperse these, and we'll get to that. But first, I'm going to read a little bit to you out of here. And he's talking about, when I start off reading, it says, whosoever has reached this point in his development. What he's talking about is someone that has spent a considerable amount of time developing their magical abilities, their visualization, their ability to do breath work, you know, to harness chi, to take in chi and direct chi through breathing, visualization, all that sorts of stuff. So when he's talking about whoever's reached this point, he's talking about anyone who has put a very considerable amount of time into developing their magical abilities and perceptions. Okay. Whosoever has reached this point in his development must very carefully consider what he thinks in a very conscientious and attentive manner, especially his plastic or three-dimensional thinking. So what he's saying right there, first line, let me break that down real quick. He's saying once you are proficient at magic, it becomes very, very important that you pay attention to your thoughts, to what you're dwelling on, to what you're feeding energy into. When he says your plastic or three-dimensional thinking, what he's talking about, like in the Golden Dawn, they used to say, never dwell on anything that you don't want to manifest. Don't spend a lot of time and don't spend a lot of energy dwelling on things that you do not want to come to pass. Because if you do, what you're doing is feeding energy into them. What he's talking about with plastic or three-dimensional thinking is they would say, not only do you not want to spend a lot of time dwelling on what you don't want to come to pass, but under no consideration should you see it in motion. Meaning, don't project yourself into the image and start seeing what it would be like whatever it is you're dreading, like when you're starting to think about what it would be like to be in that situation and what you would feel and what you would think and how it would impact your life and all that sort of stuff. That's what they're talking about whenever they say don't see it in motion. That's what he's talking about when he says three-dimensional or plastic thinking. I have no idea why he calls it plastic thinking. I can kind of understand three-dimensional just because you're putting yourself into it. You're not just seeing it on a flat surface like a picture, but you're experiencing the motion of it. But number one, don't focus a lot of attention and energy on what you don't want your life to look like. Number two, if by some chance you do finding yourself thinking about it, don't spend a lot of time and energy visualizing it in motion, putting yourself into the stream of it. So that's what he's saying. Control your thoughts, basically. The ability of concentration, which has been awakened through long, continued exercises, calls forth penetrating pictures in the Akasha, which are animated through plastic thinking to a very high degree, and which therefore aspire to become reality. What he's saying is that when you have trained your mind to focus on an image, you are imprinting it. He calls it the Akasha in here. Other magicians, like in the Golden Dawn, called it the astral light or the astral plane, where whenever you concentrate on something for a long period of time, you are creating a pattern of it in the astral or etheric or akashic realm, whatever name you want to put on it. You are creating an imprint on that level of energy by focusing concentrated effort into maintaining that thought. He's saying when you have developed your powers of concentration, the images, the imprints that you create in the etheric or akashic realms are going to be far more potent than the imprints that other people create. You know, the average person, their thoughts skip around all the time. The average person only maintains a thought for maybe a couple of seconds before they skip on to something else. If you've actually trained your concentration, it's not going to do that. It's going to stay in one spot, stay in one place. I lost my place. Okay. Therefore, always have only noble and pure thoughts, and endeavor to change all your passions into good attributes or virtues. At this point of development, the magician's soul must be ennobled to such a degree that he is incapable of harboring evil thoughts or wishing someone ill. A magician must always be friendly and obliging, help others whenever he possibly can, and assist with advice and deeds. Be considerate, accommodating, and discreet whenever you're called upon by someone to be those things. What he's essentially saying is the reason for that, it's not for virtue signaling. It's not so you can pat yourself on the back and congratulate yourself that you're a good person because you're thinking good thoughts about people or you're doing good deeds to try to help someone. It's not about being a good person at all. It's about if you are thinking bad of people, you are sending negative energy towards them. You are directing negativity at that person. This is essentially whenever you hear in old times about people casting the evil eye at you, that's what you're doing. And if you have trained and developed your abilities of concentration and focus and energy direction and manipulation, then if you're thinking negative crap at people, then it is going to be even more potent than the random person just hating on someone. You know, just like the random person sees somebody on the street and hates on them because they've got a better car than they do, or, you know, whatever it is. For most of those people, it's going to be a fleeting thing over in a couple of seconds. But if you've trained your concentration, then you are sending a very real current of energy towards that person that will have an effect on them. You don't want to walk around just randomly, accidentally cursing people, you know, for all intents and purposes. That's kind of what you're doing. If you have a greatly refined and developed sense of concentration, then when you start hating on people, you are sending negative energy at them. You are cursing that person. So he's saying that's why it's so important to focus your mind on positive things. Don't hate on people, and to the best of your ability, send good energy towards people. That's why you want to think the best of people. You don't want to criticize people all the time. If they're screwing up, you know, don't condemn them. Just think, well, they're doing the best they can, whatever it is, or don't think about it at all. You know, let them do them, as they say these days. Don't judge them. Don't send negative energy at them. Let me see, one second. He's talking about the true magician here. He says he must be free of ambition, haughtiness, arrogance, or boastfulness. These passions will reflect in the Akasha, and since the Akasha principle is in possession of the analog of harmony, the Akasha would place the greatest obstacles into the magician's path to impede his further development. More seriously, the Akasha can make it completely impossible for him to develop any further. In other words, one second. In other words, basically don't get full of yourself. Don't live in a state of entitlement. Don't, basically, I guess that's what it comes down to. There's no point in even belaboring it or going on any more than that. Essentially, just don't get too full of yourself. Don't, and the ambition, the thing about ambition is, in the beginning stages of magic, or in the intermediate stages of magic, when you get really good at manifesting things, because that's usually the first step. You'll get really, really good at manifesting whatever it is that you're wanting to create in this world. You start to think of all the different things you could have, all the different things you could be, all the different scenarios that you could find yourself in, and you start to manifest those. And you may get hungry. That's what he calls, what was the word he used? Ambition. That was it. It's like somebody asked me one time, what do I think it was that caused the people who were trying to murder me, the people who were, keeping me on death row, even keep this in mind. After the DNA results came back in my case, I stayed on death row for another 2 years. 2 years after the DNA came back. So because the prosecutor, the cops, the judge, the attorney general, none of them wanted to admit that they had made a mistake in my case. Their ambition had gotten them advanced along their career paths. Their ambition is what was willing to make them murder an innocent person in order to maintain the positions that they had acquired. Ambition can be a very, very dangerous thing. But what happens also as you progress along this path, there are certain techniques that you're given later on that result in the death of desire. You will cease to desire. That doesn't mean you won't still have preference. You will still prefer one thing over another. You would prefer to be here rather than there. You would prefer to, wear this instead of that. You would prefer to eat this. But what I mean by you will not experience desire, but you will have preference. Desire is like hunger. It's thirst. It's want. Preference is more like you've eliminated those things and you have discernment. You can discern each situation, each thing that you may have access to. You can discern whether this thing is going to be for your greater development, for your evolution. Yes, absolutely. Marilyn says nothing ever satisfies desire for very long. That is absolutely true. Desire is what keeps you bound in this realm. Desire is what chains you to this level of reality. In order to break the chains which bind you to the stars, you must eradicate desire. That doesn't mean you suppress it. That doesn't mean you repress it. That doesn't mean you pretend not to feel it. What it means is you take that desire through very specific techniques and you transmute it into a higher form of energy. Once you do that enough times, desire will cease to arise. And I'm going to stop right there with the Franz Barden because we can, yep, absolutely, Sheev. Sheev says we can't have a positive life if we have constantly negative thoughts. That is 100% true. 100% true. I'm going to stop with this for right now. We still had a lot more to go, but we're already almost 20 minutes in, and I want to get to the vampires. Let me skim through this real quick. Here's one more thing. A true magician never harbors any kind of hate towards any religion or sect. He is aware that every religion has its particular system which should lead to God, and therefore he respects it. He knows that every religion makes mistakes, but he refrains from condemning them because every dogma serves the spiritual maturity of its followers. What that means is that every path is not meant for every person. This is why we don't go around preaching or trying to convert people to magic. Magic is not for everyone. Those who are meant to find it will find it. We're not supposed to convince people that they need to take up this path. Some people are at a level of understanding in their lives when we will be drawn to what we resonate with. If you are at a level of development where you resonate at the same frequency as Catholicism or Christianity, then that's the path that you should follow, because that's what's going to feed you at your current state of development. If it's Islam, if you resonate at a frequency that's going to make you compatible with Islam, that's going to make you able to get more out of that particular path, then that's the one that they should be following. If it's Buddhism, all of these different paths exist. Believe me, these religions would not exist if God did not want them to exist. Nothing that exists in this world could do so without the blessing or outside of the will of God. All of these paths exist because different people need them. You may not need them, I may not need them, but somebody needs them. So we don't judge them. Let each person follow the path that they are best suited to follow. And I'm going to stop before we go on, because I don't want to get too deep off into this and not be able to go to the yes, exactly, Fina, diversity. 1 second, I'm going to read you something really quickly here. So remember a while ago, whenever I first started off, I was talking about how vampires were not created by the devil or any of that sort of stuff like you see in Dracula or any of these kinds of things. They were created by magicians. So I'm going to read you something real quick. In the traditions and phenomena of vampirism, we are dealing with the last survivals of an ancient technique aimed at personal immortality. That technique once had a deeper and more spiritual meaning according to magical tradition. Those who took part in it did so as an act of sacrifice, removing themselves from the cycle of reincarnation for a time in order to serve some purpose that required more than a single lifetime. In ancient times, kingship was deeply intertwined with traditions of service and sacrifice, which did not stop at the boundary of a single life. In the earliest Egyptian dynasties, similarly, the Pharaoh's task of mediating between Egyptian society and the divine powers merely underwent a change of form at death. It was only much later, when the original purpose of the system had been lost, that it fell into the hands of the selfish and greedy and turned into an attempt to cheat death altogether. By the time it appears in the historical record, the system was basically parasitic, exploiting the living for the sake of the dead. Only those wealthy or powerful enough to provide for a tomb and regular sacrifices could have any hope of making use of it. When new traditions and the collapse of ancient cultures cut the ground out from under the system and made it impossible to arrange for the specific forms of burial and the regular sacrifices that were necessary parts of it, it became parasitic in a far more obvious sense. So last time I was talking about how, you know what? I'm not gonna start that yet. I'm not gonna go into that. But I was talking about how this started with the Pharaohs in ancient Egypt. Keep in mind, the system of immortality was in place in ancient Sumer. The Egyptians, he says, by the time it entered the historical record, which is in the Egyptian stuff, by that point it had already been corrupted and started to be used by selfish people who were trying to cheat the death process altogether. in the beginning, the reason that these techniques had existed, and you'll find tombs to this day in the year, what was it? It was in the 2000s. It was after the US invaded Iraq. They found the tomb of Gilgamesh, one of the original Sumerian kings that was still existing in the 2000s. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but you can find it online. Just start Googling, discovery, tomb of Gilgamesh, Iraq. But these tombs were created in a way, and this embalming process, this preserving process, was done in a way where it was meant to last a long, long time. And the reason it was meant to last a long time is because if you were a king or anyone close to the king, like a queen or some of the king's closest relatives or closest kin, your job, the reason you were a king is because your job was to be the connection, the go-between between the world of man and the world of the gods. You were meant to intercede on behalf of humanity with the gods. Just because your body died did not mean that that job was over. You were supposed to keep doing that even after the death of your physical body, which is why they would develop these techniques to prevent you from going through the second death. A true magician, Sarah says tomb discovery was 2003. There you go. 2003 they discovered the tomb of Gilgamesh that existed prior to anything that the Egyptians did. Keep in mind, most of what the Egyptians did, they either copied or were influenced by the Sumerians. Even the Egyptian hieroglyphics, they didn't develop the hieroglyphics. The very first written language in the history of the world was cuneiform, Sumerian cuneiform. It was the original language of magic. The Egyptians saw cuneiform, and that's what inspired them to start creating hieroglyphics. So 1 second, and we're going to talk about the difference between the authentic vampire. But what I mean by the authentic vampire, this is the difference between what we see portrayed in movies and fiction versus what they truly are in real life. And and by fiction and movies, I mean anything from these modern things that sparkle when the sun hits them. What is that? What's that called? Twilight. The Twilight vampires that sparkle in the sun and they basically remain teenagers forever. To Bela Lugosi, and the Dracula, to honestly the closest thing out there to real vampirism, and it's still not even close, would be Nosferatu. The original vampires were not attractive. They're not seductive. They are basically things that feed on the living. There's nothing, they had no redeeming qualities. But let me see. In order to make sense of the vampire, the first and most crucial step is to forget everything you think you already know about vampires. Every detail in the modern image of the vampire comes from fiction rather than from authentic folklore. The shadow of Bela Lugosi's cape reaches far. To examine the authentic folklore of the vampire is to enter a different world, one governed by the rules of magic rather than those of Hollywood script writing. To begin with the standard way, he goes into things like how people traditionally become vampires in fiction. Ellie says, don't be a Nosferatu, be a Yes-feratu. Exactly. My brain went dead. What was I talking? The way people traditionally become vampires in fiction, it's usually done by being bitten by one. But in the traditional stories of vampirism, there were a whole bunch of other ways. The range of potential ways to become a vampire are extensive enough that nearly any corpse was suspect. And in many areas, the bodies of the dead were automatically dug up after a year or so, checked to make sure they had decayed properly, and then buried in a permanent grave. An equal diversity of options surrounds the activities of vampires once they come into being. That means once they come into being, they do a lot of different things. In most of Central and Eastern Europe, it's held that a vampire will first seek out and attack the members of its own family, then go on to neighbors and friends before finally feeding on anyone within reach. Other traditions hold that a vampire's targets are chosen more or less at random, or starting with whomever lives the closest to the vampire's grave. In some areas, vampires are held to drink blood, usually by biting the chest of their victims. In others, vampires are believed to strangle or smother their victims, or simply to spread illness and death by their presence alone. Some traditions hold that vampires physically leave their graves and stalk through the night in much the same way as their Hollywood equivalents, but this view was a very minority one. More common is the idea that what leaves the grave is a good deal less solid, a cloudy, blurred shape, tangible but soft to the touch. That's very important. More common is the idea that what leaves the grave is a good deal less solid, a cloudy, blurred shape, tangible but soft to the touch. What he's describing here, remember last time when I told you how to actually see the aura? You need a white wall, you hold your hand at arm's length like this, and you look at the wall. You envision that there's a black spot on the white wall, and you look at that black spot through your thumb and finger here. Don't look at your hand at all, just look at the black spot. And what happens is that eventually you'll start to see a vague, fuzzy outline around your hand that will look like heat rising off of the highway on a hot summer day, or if you've ever been putting gas in a car, and or somebody else is doing it, and you look over and you see the fumes of the gasoline coming off out of the tank. That's what comes out of the grave. That is your etheric body. Only in modern times has the soul been seen as one solid thing, like a ghost. No history, no other culture, no other tradition in the history of the world up until modern times saw the soul as one whole thing. It consists of parts or pieces. Like, for example, in ancient Egypt, there was the Ka and the Ba, the Ka and the Ba. Let me make sure. I believe the Ka was, the Ba was the astral body. The Ka is the etheric body. Remember when I was talking about how there are different levels of reality? There's the physical level of reality, there's the etheric level of reality, there's the astral level of reality, there's the spiritual level of reality. Well, in Egyptian terminology, the Ka is the etheric level of reality. That's the one that is so dense it's almost physical, which is why you can train your physical eye to be able to detect it, because it's very, very close to the physical realm. The key to creating a vampire was to keep the Ka intact. When we're talking about the second death is when the Ka begins to unravel. First death, the physical body dies. Second death, the Ka unravels or starts to die. If you keep the Ka intact, that basically creates a vampire. Let me see. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to shut up for a second and keep reading. Hold on. So let's see. These patterns of folklore, like the vampire itself, have deep historical roots, and a glance at these roots will lay the foundation for a clearer understanding of what actually lies behind the vampire legend. Many historical studies of vampire lore begin by surveying the wide range of predatory spirits in the traditions and cultures around the world. Even though some of these spirits have certain vampire-like qualities, this sort of approach is misleading at best. The vampire is not a non-human spirit as most of these other entities are. Predatory non-human spirits are classified with demons, or spirits that in some cases are synonymous with the Fae, not with vampires. Central to vampirism is the point that the vampire was once a living human being and only entered the vampiric state after passing through the process of physical death. To grasp the deeper historical roots of vampirism, it's necessary to take a different approach. Such an exploration must necessarily be speculative in places, since the origins of the vampire tradition date back to eras well before written history. I'm going to skip ahead. One thing about it, the thing he said about vampires are human spirits. They were once human beings. They were once living people. There are other things in existence. Remember how I was talking about how we live in a spiritual ecosystem? That there are all sorts of things around us. There's more than just dead people. There's more than ghosts. There's more than angels. There's more than demons. There's more than fae. We exist within a vast, massive ecosystem of spiritual entities. We are one ourselves. We just also inhabit a physical body. We also exist on all these other levels of reality where these other things may not necessarily exist. The thing about vampires in the modern day is they are very, very, very rare. This is because the techniques that allow them to survive are almost never carried out anymore. However, there are other things that act almost exactly like vampires. And you can deal with them basically the same way, but you know, for example, you are hardly ever going to find anyone alive who has experienced a real vampire attack outside of certain European countries, Eastern European countries, where they still practice some of these burial techniques. We don't do anything in the US that would enable this to happen. However, you may experience attacks from other entities. I have. A lot of, if you've ever experienced anything that they call a hag attack, or remember we were talking about among the Hmong people, Vietnamese people, they call it the Da Cho. The Da Cho is something very similar, but it was never a human being. Myself personally, and not just myself, but other people too, this almost always happens while you are sleeping or while you are in that twilight state in between sleeping and waking. And, well, I'm not going to get into more of that right now. I'm going to go into some more of this first, and we can come back to that later if you guys are interested in it. But first I want to say, you know, we're talking about written history and how a lot of this begins with Egypt. Keep in mind, one thing I always like to point out to people is to the ancient Egyptians, they did not call their land Egypt. That was not the name of it. They called it, the Egyptians, the true Egyptians, called it Khem, K-H-E-M. It's an old word that means black. The reason they called it that is they were talking about the soil along the Nile River. That soil was so dense and rich with nutrients that it was black. So when you would hear about, for example, black magic, they were all that meant originally, it did not mean evil magic. It did not mean dark, bad magic. It meant traditions that existed at least all the way back to the time of Khem, to the time of Egypt. You were talking about traditions that had either originated there or were at least that old, because remember, a lot of this stuff began in Sumer, and the Egyptians just picked it up later. When we think of ancient Egypt nowadays, nearly all of what comes to mind relates to the Egyptian obsession with the secrets of the afterlife. Few societies in all of history have been so intently focused on the mastery of death and the attainment of immortality. The largest single body of surviving ancient Egyptian literature consists of handbooks to help the dead escape the dangers of the Duat, the underworld where the sun went at night, and achieve eternal life. The Book of Coming Forth by Day, better known nowadays as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, is the oldest and most famous of these handbooks, but there were many others. Central to this lore was a set of teachings about the different souls or spiritual aspects of each human being. The two most important souls in Egyptian thought were the Ba and the Ka, which correspond almost exactly to the modern magical concept of the astral and etheric bodies, respectively. The Ba, according to Egyptian lore, was not bound to the physical body and could travel to distant places, basically astral projection. Its emblem in Egyptian art was a human-headed bird, representing its powers of astral flight. So anytime in Egyptian hieroglyphics you see a bird with a human head, you know that what that is portraying is the person's astral body. While the Ka was linked to the physical body, it could travel for short distances away from it, but had to return regularly and could not survive if the physical body decayed or was destroyed. To maintain life after physical death, Egyptian teachings held the critical point was to preserve the Ka in working order. This required, first of all, the permanent preservation of the physical body, a requirement that led to the development of ever more complex technologies of mummification. Second, magical processes to open the mouth of the Ka and enable it to take in nourishment. And third, regular offerings made to the Ka so that it would not wither away from starvation. So basically, magicians, trained magicians, can consume etheric energy, can take in etheric energy from other sources. Most people, your average living person, can only take it in through eating and drinking and breathing. Our breath is very, very connected to etheric energy. That's the number one way that we take in energy, is by breathing. Well, when most people die, they can't do that anymore. They can't take that in. That's why the second death happens. That's why the etheric body begins to unravel. It's essentially starving to death. A trained magician, on the other hand, will know how to keep taking chi, keep taking this energy from other sources. But that's what the opening of the mouth is. And that's also why they made these sacrifices. And when I'm saying sacrifices, I mean anything from, like if you go to these Egyptian tombs, like in the Met, there are actual entire tombs kept in there. You'll see these hieroglyphics on the wall where you'll see all of these people, like there's the altar, first you'll see a slit in the wall. It's a long, tall slit. That's the doorway that the Pharaoh or the mummy was said to come through to receive these offerings that these priests or these magi were giving him, which were put on this altar. That could be anything from animals, like you'll see lines of hieroglyphics of people carrying in birds, geese, ducks, chickens, carrying in goats, carrying in cattle that they would sacrifice on this altar to this Pharaoh. Keep in mind, the reason they're doing that, and the reason that so many of these old traditions place such emphasis on blood, is because in your body, it is your blood that carries your etheric energy. That's why the Catholic Church used to, for example, whenever they were trying to kill heretics, more often than not, they would burn them at the stake rather than kill them in a way that would let their blood spill out onto the ground. Because if their blood spilled out onto the ground, that energy would go to feed whatever egregore they were being martyred for. The chi, the life force in their blood would feed these other religions, these other gods, these other things that they were worshiping. I had a point with this. Where was I going? Oh, so in the Egyptian tombs, in the Egyptian temples, that chi that is in the blood was being given to the pharaoh so that he could consume it. And, you know, he can't eat the meat. He can't sit down and eat a chicken anymore. But he can consume the chi. He can consume the etheric energy from the blood of the chicken or the duck or the cow or whatever it is. It sounds kind of morbid whenever you think about it, but essentially it's no different than what we do every day. You know, every day we eat chickens, every day we eat ducks, every day we eat hamburgers. We're really not doing anything different. You know, they're just giving it to him in a form that he could consume. One second. In the language of modern magic, food and drink were used to provide the ka with a steady source of etheric energy so that it would be able to maintain its existence and avoid the second death, the process through which the human soul sheds its etheric body after death and goes on into the afterlife. The tomb of every Egyptian who could afford mummification thus had a ka temple connected to it, and each of these temples had at least one ka priest, whose job it was to feed the ka of the dead with sacrifices every day. If the ka no longer received these offerings, it faced a peculiarly unpleasant fate. As chapters 52 and 53 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead make clear, a ka who did not receive offerings had to venture out of its tomb at night to find what nourishment it could. And that normally added up to excrement and urine, two readily available sources of low-grade etheric energy. Remember last time I told you anything that comes out of the body hot has chi in it? Spitting, pissing, feces, all of that comes out of the body warm. It's warm because it contains a small amount of chi, of life force. These vampires that weren't being fed, these mummies that weren't being fed, would have to resort to absorbing the chi out of waste products. Let me see. Not all, and they called them Khu, K-H-U. Not all Khu restricted themselves to filth. Some invaded the houses of the living, causing physical or mental illness. There is even a passage in the Book of the Dead that seems to indicate that Khu could attack the living directly and drink their blood. Once the system was well established, therefore, it was very hard to safely stop. The cost of sacrifices and the upkeep of ka priests became an economic burden large enough to play a major role in the collapse of several Egyptian dynasties. But the system continued solidly in place until Egypt fell under Persian rule in the 6th century before the Common Era, and even then lingered on in places until the coming of Christianity. Egypt was not the only part of the world where the quest for personal immortality was followed in this way, however. Rather, it's the best documented example of a very widespread set of traditions. Over much of the world in very ancient times, burial mounds of packed earth or stone were raised above the tombs of kings and nobles. Various kinds of mummification were used to preserve their bodies, and offerings were made to their spirits to maintain them in a state different from those of the ordinary dead. And you see there why vampirism also became synonymous with aristocracy. Count Dracula, for example, or the Pharaohs in ancient Egypt. Vampirism in the early days was always connected with the aristocratic classes because they were the only ones who could afford to have these huge temples built, to have these, intricate mummification processes carried out, to be able to afford to pay for priests who are going to keep giving them these sacrifices to them for decades after they were dead. Your average person, your average dead soul could not do that. Over much of the world, in turn, these traditions were replaced in more recent times by a very different set. One that focused on destroying the bodies of the dead rather than preserving them. The details of the transition from one approach to the other seem to have varied from place to place. In some cases, societies seem to have collapsed under the economic burden of supporting past generations, or were conquered by less overloaded neighbors. In other cases, violent uprisings, in effect revolutions of the living against the dead, shattered the ancient system, while in other cases the causes of the transition are uncertain. Still, the impact was dramatic, and it can be traced across the world in the archaeological records. What he's saying is, all of a sudden, people started to wake up and start, instead of trying to preserve these preserve these vampires, people started, for whatever reason, all across the world, taking the opposite approach and trying to make sure those bodies decayed as quickly as possible. They didn't try to preserve them anymore. Even in our society now, we're not really preserving them. When we think about them, like putting them in coffins and then putting them in the ground, we use an embalming process where in a few weeks, if you were to dig that body up and look at it, it'd be pretty messed up. It's going to turn into goo really quickly. And this is one of the things you'll know down in New Orleans. Like, they still practice crypts. They still have tombs in New Orleans. But the bodies are not preserved in there the way they were in these old traditions. Like, when you go to these tombs in New Orleans, you'll see in these cemeteries, for example, one tomb will be smaller than this little room where I'm sitting. It'll be the size of a shed in someone's backyard. But when you look at the tag on the tomb, you'll see that it's got like 25 people listed as all being in the same tomb. And you're like, well, how the hell did they cram 25 bodies in this one tomb? Well, what it is, the reason it happened, how they do that is because, number one, it is hot as hell there. If you ever been, in the deep south in July and August, it is just mind-numbingly hot. It's why people down there lose their wits and go crazy, because the heat overloads their brain a lot of times, especially around in like Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi. But that heat in those tombs basically turns them into an oven. The floor of those tombs, there's bars on the floor, but there's deep holes dug up under them. You put those bodies in those tombs in that heat, and it basically cooks them, bakes them. They're not going to last very long. That bakes them up. They fall down into the holes in the ground. If you were to open one of those tombs and look down into those holes, you would find basically a mass of jumbled up bones and stuff down in the bottom of there, where it's just a pile of all of these bodies. That heat destroys them very, very quickly down there. I don't know how I went off on that. Give me 1 second. Let me find where we were. Oh, we were talking about how it changed from trying to preserve these bodies to trying to get rid of these bodies. There are two main areas of the world where the older traditions survived into much more recent times. One of these was in northern, central, and eastern Europe, where mound burial remained standard for kings and aristocrats until 1000 CE. So about 1000, the year 1000. So that's about, what is this, 2021? It's about 1021 years ago. They were doing this in Eastern Europe all the way up until just like 1000 or so years ago. The other place is China. The other was in China, where the traditional Confucian cult of the ancestors made it unthinkable to destroy the bodies of the dead, and where the pursuit of immortality remained a major cultural force until the communist takeover in 1949. These areas have something else in common, of course. They are the two regions where vampires have been reported in large numbers in historical times. The two places where they preserve these traditions the longest are the two places that have the most accounts, written accounts of vampirism existing all the way into the modern day. Eastern Europe and China. See what else we should cover here. It's easy to trace what must have happened. Like the starving coup of Egyptian lore, the etheric bodies of those who followed this ancient tradition had to venture out by night looking for nourishment. As the tradition developed and took on increasingly corrupt and destructive forms, the nourishment in question came increasingly from living beings. The end result of these developments was the vampire. So basically, since there are no priests giving these offerings to these souls anymore, they had no choice but to turn and start feeding on the living. One second, let me skip ahead. Okay. What lies behind the legends and lore of the vampire, then, is the remnant of an ancient magical technique, one that aimed at personal immortality through the construction of what modern magicians call an etheric revenant. That's what a vampire is. It's an etheric revenant. Some people just call it a revenant. Anytime you hear the word revenant or etheric revenant, they're talking about a vampire. They're just using a fancier magic phrase for it. This process has been understood in occult circles for a very long time, and the general outlines of the technique have been published in occult literature several times over the last century and a half. Those who seek detailed information on the technique, though, will not find it in such sources, or in this one. Some kinds of knowledge are better off forgotten, and the technical methods of constructing an etheric revenant have earned a place high up on that particular list. In general terms, though, the technique is a way of deliberately evading the second death. It's when the second death doesn't take place properly that the soul stays within reach of the world of the living. Ghosts, as we'll see later on, fall into this state by accident. In the case of the vampire, by contrast, the failure to pass through the second death happens intentionally. In some cases, would-be vampires begin the process of evading the second death while still alive, using exercises to strengthen and condense the etheric body, and thus helping it resist the disintegration process of the second death. In other cases, types of magical practice that aren't specifically aimed at vampirism can produce the same changes in the etheric body as a side effect, and make vampirism a possibility. In still others, the transformation of the etheric body begins after physical death. A soul that is strong enough to remain conscious in the twilight of the after-death state, and frightened enough to try to avoid the transition out of that realm, may learn or may already know the trick of stabilizing the etheric body and may be able to put it to use before etheric disintegration has gone too far. As long as the etheric body stays intact, the second death cannot begin. And so the goal of the vampire is to keep the etheric body strong enough to resist the natural process of disintegration. This can be done for a time by using the methods just described, but there are two further requirements that have to be met if the etheric body is to stay intact for very long. The first is the preservation of the vampire's corpse in a state that can sustain some etheric functions. For if the physical body is destroyed, the etheric body is destabilized and quickly unravels. The second is a regular source of fresh etheric energy to replace what is used up or lost in the course of the vampire's day-to-day, or rather night-to-night, existence. For the sources used by living people, mostly connected to breathing, are closed off permanently once the first stage of death begins. So essentially, two of the things that are necessary, number one is knowing what you're doing, being able to feed the etheric body. Number two is preservation of the corpse after your death. And number three is, if you don't know how to take in this energy yourself, having someone who's feeding it to you, like these priests did in the old days. Any of those things don't happen, the vampire ceases to exist. It will eventually starve to death. This is why all of these techniques to get rid of vampires that people used to do, like burning the corpse, you know, they would dig. And if you really want an interesting story, there have been vampires reported in the United States all the way up, I can't remember what year this was, but Mercy Brown in Rhode Island. If you want an interesting story, Google Mercy Brown. She was a girl in Rhode Island whose family is very, very connected into vampire lore. There are stories in the newspapers in Rhode Island of her family digging up her grave and burning her corpse because she was feeding on the rest of the family. This was all the way up into, I can't remember if it was the 1800s or the 1900s, one or the other, but it's relatively recently enough where it was in newspapers, not hieroglyphics, not ancient historical stories or anything else, in the newspaper. So it has existed in rare occasions, not very often, just because of the, Indio says 1892. So Mercy Brown was in 1892, so that's after the Civil War. Keep in mind the Civil War was 1861 to 1865, so you're talking about 50 years, give or take, after the Civil War. You still got people digging up corpses in the United States and burning them. That's the number one way to get rid of them. The other way, garlic. That is a true thing. Garlic contains a chemical called allicin, A-L-L-I-C-E-N. Allicin is what, like when people eat garlic, you know, like the next day you smell it on their breath, or you can smell it coming out of the pores of their skin. Allicin is the chemical that has the detrimental effect on being fed on by this etheric body. The other thing, much like the Fae, is iron. Traditionally, the tool that magicians used whenever they were getting rid of stuff like this, whenever they were fighting things like this, is the trident. You know, the thing that has 3 teeth on it, like Poseidon has. You would have one, you know, not that long, not like one of those giant Poseidon ones, but usually you'd have one about this long. It's just got like a small handle on it, small wooden handle about this long, almost like a little, like a garden tool, sort of, made of iron that you blessed. When you have, you know, you're blessing it, putting that blessed energy, that chi into it, combining that divine blessing with that iron of the trident, you can actually puncture these things. So one way that people do it in modern times, if, like I said, you're rarely going to encounter a real vampire in modern times. And I'm going to cut this off in just a second. I see we're already over an hour and I don't want to keep you all night. But I think just the way to end this up is telling you how to deal with such a thing like this if you were to encounter something like this. Iron is very detrimental to these two etheric energies. So, for example, if you wanted to use garlic, you could take a bouquet, and you know the grave that the vampire is in, you could take a bouquet of flowers and just chop up garlic, stuff it in the bouquet of flowers, stuff a ton of garlic in there, and go lay those flowers on the grave so that the garlic is there on top of it also. remember the etheric energy has to come up from out of the body in order to go feed. It would have to come in contact with that garlic whenever it would come up through the flowers. That's going to have a very detrimental effect on it, and nobody's ever even going to know it's there, because all they're ever going to see is a bouquet of flowers laying on the grave. Another thing you can do is take iron nails. The bigger, the longer, the better. You take those iron nails and you push them down all into the grave. You don't got to dig down to the coffin or any of that kind of stuff. Just drive those iron nails down all into the grave like spikes, so that whenever that etheric energy tries to come up, it will puncture itself on those iron nails, and it will help to disintegrate it. When I was having the experience that I had, it happened to me twice, where I was experiencing something. Yeah, Bonessa says railroad nails, railroad spikes. Yes, Michael says the same thing. Railroad spikes, great for this. Yes, absolutely. Railroad spikes are big, thick, sharp. Those would be perfect, and you can usually find those walking along train tracks. What was the other thing? Oh, yes. When I was having these experiences, and I had them twice, the other thing you can do is, normally, like I said, you're going to have it's going to happen when you're either asleep or in that state between sleeping and waking, that twilight state. So it's usually going to be in your bed. That's going to be the number one place that you experience something like this, will be when you are in bed. So what's the number one thing that they say is detrimental to vampirism? The sun, the sunlight. You take herbs that correspond to solar energy. For example, St. John's wort. St. John's wort is one of the herbs that correspond to the sun, correspond to solar energy. You can take St. John's wort and put it inside a red velvet bag, or even cut out 2 red circles of cloth and put St. John's wort in between them, and then sew them together so that you've created a disc of St. John's wort, and hang that over your bed. The other thing is you can put a nail in there with it. Take an iron nail and put it in with the St. John's wort and hang that up there. You can also, this is a little more technical, looks a little more crazy, make something like a wind chime out of nails. If you take a string and take a bunch of nails and tie them in the string so that they're pointing in all different directions, and you hang that above your bed like a wind chime, it's the same thing as driving nails into the grave, where if something is trying to come onto you while you're sleeping, it's going to puncture itself on those nails. Someone that I used to know that had their own magic shop used to sell something for this very purpose. He would take 2 iron nails, about that big, and he would put them in the form of a cross, and take red string and wrap it around them over and over and over, so that they weren't ever coming apart. Not unless you cut that string, they're not going to come apart by accident. So you've got a cross made out of iron nails, and you could do the same thing. You could hang that above your bed. That usually is going to do the trick. Another thing, remember a while ago when I was talking about the trident being the traditional weapon that magicians use when dealing with stuff like this, and how you bless it and that makes it even more powerful? Same thing with holy water. When you bless water, when you're putting chi into water, you're creating holy water. If you throw that through, if you can move, a lot of times people experience sleep paralysis. If you can make yourself move and you can throw that water around you, just throw, splash it out in the general direction. Do it like, just have a little chalice and you can just splash it like that. That will get rid of it. That will disperse it. This is where those stories comes from about, the vampire not being able to cross running water. It's because water disturbs that energy. It will carry it away. You will disperse it with holy water. Yeah, and I guess that's about it. We've went a little over an hour. We've gone up to almost 70 minutes. Just looking at what you guys are talking about. Looks like y'all are talking about Elizabeth Bathory. Yeah, she was something else. When we're talking about vampires and vampirism in this sense, we're talking about things that are dead, things that are supernatural. Elizabeth Bathory was, probably something more along the lines of a psychopath or a serial killer. No, I have never seen the Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. I've never heard of that. And I've never heard of Stay Alive, Vegas Vamp. No, I've never heard of those things. So, Nick, that's a good idea. Nick is saying, what about Michel Belager's Kefrian order? Again, they are practicing some of the same techniques that he's describing in this book. They are... Philippe says would this be contrary to the solar body? The thing is, a true magician, just like you don't need any tools to do magic, a true magician in the highest sense of the word, meaning someone who, like in ceremonial magic, to become a mage is a very specific achievement that is beyond a master. When you cross the abyss, the first level you achieve is master. You become Magister Templii, master of the temple. After you are a master, then even beyond a master is a mage. So when they're talking about a magician in the truest sense of the word, you are talking about someone who is beyond the level of a master. Someone who is at that stage of development no longer needs these tools because they are going to have transcended all of this. They are going to be outside the borders and boundaries of time and space. Their body will still be within time and space. Their consciousness and their energy will not be. It will have transcended those things. They will have no need of this. Someone who has reached that stage will pretty much be able to do whatever they choose to do. If they choose to keep their etheric body from disintegrating, they will keep their etheric body from disintegrating. They can come back into and out of this realm at will. It is something entirely different. Anyway, I'm not going to keep you guys on here all night, but somebody brought up Michel Belager's group. I would highly suggest, if you're interested, that may be a topic you want to look more into. She tries to do the same thing with the word vampire that people in the 60s and 70s tried to do with the word witch. Like give it a makeover so that people don't see it in the same way. She tried to do that with the word vampire. She basically uses magic, tai chi, lots of energy work, all that kind of stuff. She wrote a book called The Psychic Vampire Codex, which I highly, highly recommend reading. If you have no interest in vampirism whatsoever, you will still find it incredibly useful for energy work techniques, especially the workbook part of it. All right, guys, I hope y'all have a good night. Thank you so much for joining me on here. The next live stream we do, we're going to cover, I don't know which one yet. Maybe we'll do angels, maybe we'll do demons. Hey Jen, it's good to see you on here. Maybe we'll do the Fae, but we're going to delve into another aspect of the supernatural realm, another entity that exists within that realm, and we'll talk about that next, just like we did with vampires tonight. All right, guys, I love you all. I hope you have a good night, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.